Is this long enough, or I could make this longer?
Whatever you think. Where do I put the stick? Right here?
Yeah, that's fine.
Lower, higher, doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's good. So, is this long enough, or do you want?
Yeah, I don't think I'll move too much more now. Then the leash is ready.
Yeah, fine.
I'll probably stand like over here. This area. Okay, I'm good to go? Okay, so welcome everyone. We're going to do a presentation now on the Hilchos Beis Abchira. We'll just divide it into three parts. Part one, we'll just talk a little bit about the importance about learning about Hilchos Beis Abchira. Part two, we'll go a little bit into the history of the Mishkan by Ezrushnoshim and by Sheni, and the Golus between by Ezrushnoshim and by Sheni. We'll see how the Rambam also starts off Hilchos Beis Abchira with that, talks a little bit about the history. And then part three, we'll get into the actual structure. We're not going to go through this entire presentation. There's not enough time. We're probably going to hit around the Ezra's Kainim, Ezra's Yisrael, Ezra's Kainim, the Mizbeh area. So let's begin. Let's see if this is over here. Okay, so just for starters, a little bit about the importance of learning about Beis Abchira in general, and especially now during the 3 weeks. So there's a very famous Medrash Tanchuma that the Rebbe quotes in many sichos, where there's a conversation between Yecheskel, who was, I think at the time he was in Bavel, and Hashem, and it says, Yecheskel was claiming to Hashem, are the Yidden able to build the Beis HaMikdash? That you're telling me about it, and I should give them a message about the details of the Beis HaMikdash? They're not able to. And therefore, hiniach lehen, leave them be, until they come back from Golus, because this was the time that they were in the Golus after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. Then afterwards, I'll go and tell them. So, Omer le'HaKadosh Baruch Hu li'Yecheskel, Hashem said to Yecheskel, Ubeshvil shebonai nesunim b'goyla yehei binin beisi batal, because my sons, the Yidden, are in Golus, is that a reason that the building of the Beis HaMikdash should be stopped? It shouldn't be active? So we see that through learning about the Beis HaMikdash, they weren't going to build it. It was through knowing about it, learning about it, hearing about it. It's like we're building it. And he continues, he says, Amar le'Kadosh Baruch Hu gadol kriyasa b'teira kibniyasa. Learning about it in the Torah is like building it, like we know the kayach of Torah, man malki rabbanon, is a kayach in Torah that when we learn about something like kol oisik b'teiras elo kihilu ikriv elo. So that's one element about the importance of learning about the Beis HaMikdash in general, and especially in the 3 weeks. Another thing to add over here is something which the Rebbe speaks about in the Sicha and Chelik Yurches. They learned it recently in the project with the Sichas, where the Rebbe explains that really we know that everything, anything that looks like Choshech, really like, just like the Yiridus and Neshama Beguf, it's a Yirid Tzarech Aliyah. And Chazal tell us clearly, Yovei Aryeh, B'mazel Aryeh, B'yachareves Ariel, Aryeh is in Nebuchadnezzar. He came in the month of Aryeh, which is the time of Ov, and he destroyed Ariel, the Beis HaMikdash. Al Menas, it was for the intent of Yovei Aryeh is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, V'yivna Aryeh, that's the Beis HaMikdash Shlishi. So we know that the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, the purpose of it was to build a bigger and better Beis HaMikdash. But still, the destruction is painful. Even if we know the intent is to build something bigger and better, it's painful, especially when it extends for as long as it is extended. And the Rebbe says that this is reflected in the fact that right after Tisha B'Av, we have a Yom Tov, the Chamisha Asar B'Av, especially if you learn in Chassidus the greatness of the Yom Tov, the Chamisha Asar B'Av, that the Chazal tell us in the Mishnah, that it's pretty much, it says it's the greatest Yom Tov, L'ho Yom Tov L'Yisrael, Ki Chamisha Asar B'Av, V'chayim HaKippurim. So that's true, that was always true throughout all of history. But in more recent generations, we have another Yom Tov connected to the 3 weeks, which is Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz. And the Rebbe points out that it doesn't really make sense the way it's structured. It seems not to make sense because it should first be the Choshech and then the Eir. First Tisha B'Av and then Chamisha Asar B'Av. But over here it's reversed. First you have Yud Beis Tammuz and then you have Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. And the Rebbe basically explains that now that we're coming closer to the coming of Mashiach, we're able to see not that there's Choshech and Eir and the Choshech is for the Eir, but really the essence of the Choshech is a deeper Eir. It's really the love of Hashem. And maybe you could use an example that's explained elsewhere in Chassidus for this. The difference between Rabbi Kiva and Nachum Ish Gamzu. Both of them said they know that everything's for the best, but there was a big fundamental difference between them. Rabbi Kiva said it was bad. It's not a good thing. He can't wake up in the morning and learn Torah. He can't learn Torah during the night with his candle. He can't travel to where he needs to go. But considering everything, it was for the best, because what would have been otherwise would have been a lot worse if he had his rooster and his donkey and the candle. Whereas by Nachum Ish Gamzu, who was the teacher, he was the Rebbe of Rabbi Akiva, he didn't say it's for the best. It's bad, but it's for the best. It's actually the greater good. It's a deeper best. Because what would happen if he came to the king and he didn't lose all the diamonds and all the pearls and precious stones? Maybe the king would be impressed. Maybe he wouldn't. The king was a wealthy person. Even if he would be impressed and he would abolish the decree, the Yidden probably scraped together the very last penny in order to get this job done, and they would have lost all the money. Now that it was switched for sand, it wasn't questionable whether the king would be impressed. He's obviously going to be impressed with such powerful sand that could defeat his enemies, and he also gave the Yidden back. He filled up the chest full of all the gold and diamonds, and so Yidden didn't lose any money out of it. And in addition, the Rosh over there got his punishment. And so now that we're coming closer to Gula, it's not just that we can see the good, the that comes after the Cheshach, but we can recognize in the Cheshach itself a greater expression and closeness from Hashem. And then finally, like the Rebbe says in Parshas Balak, Tafshin and Aleph, it's simply a matter of living with the times, because Atat Kut Mashiach, and this is especially true when you learn about the Surah of the Beis HaMikdash, that Mashiach is going to come, and you're going to know the different Shardim to get into the Harabayis, and all the names of the Shardim, you know the different Shardim to get into the Hazara, the parts of the Hazara. It'll be that's what we learned about that, something which is alive and real. So let's start, like we said, between the two parts with the history. So let's jump a little into that. So first of all, just to notice over here, you could see, and we're going to refer to it again in a little bit, that there was first the Mishkan, and there was Bayis Rishon, the Golus, and Bayis Sheni. And you can have an association in your mind that the Mishkan is the time they did and were primarily led by the Shoftim. There was really the Mishkan's 479 years. When they built Bayis Rishon, it says that the 480th year since leaving Mitzrayim. That was like the culmination. They didn't left Mitzrayim, they were in the desert, they entered Eretz Yisrael. Finally, they came to Yerushalayim, was 400, and they built the Beis HaMikdash just 480 years later. The Shoftim were like 350 years. But for the main part of the Mishkan, the Yidden were led by the Shoftim. Then you have Bayis Rishon, the Yidden were led by Nevi'im and Malachim. So the Malachim were more like political. Some of them were tremendous tzaddikim, others were tremendous Rishayim. And then there was the Nevi'im, which were obviously all tzaddikim. And then from Bayis Sheni and onwards, the Yidden are being led by the leaders are the Tanoim. There's also a political part to it, but it's primarily you have the Tanoim, and that extends for like another 120 years after the Churban. So it's like for 540 years. So let's go into each of these a little bit and talk about it. So we'll start with the Mishkan. So the Mishkan itself had 5 different kufas, and this is really how the Rambam starts. Hilchas Beis HaBechira, he starts off saying, Mitzvahs Aseh, Lases Bais Lashem Muchen Liyes Makrivim Bar Karbonis, and V'chegigim Olav Shalish Pon Bashana, and then he says, which is the Mishkan in the Midbar. And then he says, and then they entered Eretz Yisrael, they put a Mishkan in Gilgal, and then in Shiloh, and then in Noiv, and then in Givon. So let's look at those 5 different kufas. So we start off with the 39 years that the Mishkan was in the Midbar. That was followed by 14 years where it was in Gilgal. So the 14-year period is after Yeshua was already leading the Yidden. He brought them across the Yarden, and the Yidden spent 7 years conquering the nations in the land of Eretz Yisrael, and then 7 years dividing the lands. And during that time, it's sort of like a temporary place. We even know that Bikurim, Yidden weren't chayiv in Bikurim until after the 14 years, because not everybody was yet settled. So there was sort of like a transition stage in Eretz Yisrael. For 14 years, the Mishkan was in Gilgal. And then it came to a more permanent place, both in terms of the time. You can see it's a very large amount of time, 369 years, and also in terms of the physical structure. Until then, the Mishkan was entirely temporary, both in terms of the walls, was made out of materials, and the covering was also materials. Whereas in Shiloh, it was a binyan shel avonim, it was made out of stone, but the ceiling, the roof, stayed out of material. And that was there for 369 years. We're told that at the end of the 369 years, some say Eli is the final shofet, some count Shmuel as a shofet, but it's the days of Eli. At this time, basically, the Yidden were having problems with the Pelishtim, which started already earlier in the days of Shimshon. They were having problems with the Pelishtim, so they went out to war, and they decided a very good idea is to bring the Aron into battle. They're going to bring the Aron into battle. Obviously, they're going to win the war. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. Not only didn't they win the war, but the Aron was taken into captivity. Now, B'Poel Mamish, the Pelishtim sent it back very quickly because they had a lot of problems. But actually, from this point, until the Beis HaMikdash was built, the Aron was no longer in the following Mishkanos that were there. It was kept in different places, Beis Shemesh, Kiryas Yearim. It wasn't brought back into as part of the Kodesh HaKadoshim until Bayis Rishon was built by Shlomo HaMelech. So they brought this report back to Eli. They told Eli, number 1, we lost the war. Number 2, your two sons, Chafni and Pinchas, were killed. And number 3, the urn was taken into captivity. When Eli heard this, says he fell down backwards, he hit his head and he died. And right at that time, the Mishkan was destroyed. And then afterwards, they built the Mishkan in Noiv for 13 years, and then in Given for 44 years. The way you could remember the 44 years, it's basically 40 years of David HaMelech. David was a king for 40 years, and then Shlomo was a king for 40 years. The first 4 years of Shlomo's Melucha, they still were in the Mishkan in Given. And then he became king at the age of 12. He lived till 52. So at the age of 16, he started building the Beis HaMikdash. So the Beis HaMikdash was there from 4 years into Shlomo's Melucha. So for the 44 years, it's David and Shlomo. And the last 2 years of Noiv is when you have Shaul HaMelech. Shaul was a king for like 2 years. So let's see the leaders very briefly. We have Moshe Rabbeinu leading the Yidden in the Midbar. Then you have Yeshua for 28 years, 14 years of Kibbush and Chiluk, and then another 14 years. Then you have the Skenim. And then mostly, like we said, you have the Shaftim. The first one actually is mentioned in today's Chitas. Today's Chitas, it says, I don't remember the exact Lashon, but it says Kalev ben Yefune. I think it says Aknizi. And Rashi says that he was his stepson. And he had a son with Kalev's mother, Osniel. He was the first of the Shaftim. So you have all the Shaftim here, and then towards the end you have Eli and Shmuel, and then you have the 2 years of Shaul, the 40 years of David, and 4 of the 40 years of Shlomo. So when it comes to the kings of Klaus Yisrael, so there was 3 kings that ruled over an entire Klaus Yisrael, Shaul, David, and Shlomo, and then the kingdom was divided. And you'll see there's 20 kings for Yehuda and 19 for Yisrael, but Yehuda lasted like 133 years longer than Yisrael. So let's move along to that next section. So in the next section we have Bayis Rishon. So Bayis Rishon, it lasted for 410 years. It was destroyed in the year Shlach, like as a simon of Shlach. The Yidden were sent away, sent out of Eretz Yisrael into Golus. So first you have it says 40 years, but it's Shlomo Melech, we said, started building it 4 years into his Melucha. I'm not sure what the reason is. When you calculate the years of the building of the Beis HaMikdash, Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, it includes the years of building. And Bayis Rishon, I think, was 4 years. Bayis Sheni, maybe it was 7.5, or the opposite. It includes those years. I'm not sure the reason of how that works. It could be because even once they started building, they already had the fundamental parts were already there. They already had, the Aron with the Kalim inside, as well as the Mizbeh. The rest of the structure was being built. So you have 36 years of Shlomo HaMelech, and then 374 years of Malchi Yehuda, and Malchi Yisrael split is 241 years of Malchi Yisrael until they were expelled when you have the 10 lost tribes. That happened after 241 years. Just to drop a little bit of the history that happened there. So Yeravam ben Navat was one of the generals of Shlomo HaMelech. He rebelled against Shlomo. He wanted to take over the kingship. Shlomo HaMelech stopped him and then wanted to kill him, so he ran away. He left him at Mitzrayim. After Shlomo passed away, he came back, and that's when there was the split between the two Meluchas. Now, Yeravam ben Navat, he basically set up a couple of things. First of all, he made roadblocks, not allowing the Yidden to travel. So basically the way it was divided, you had down south, you had the kingdom of Yehuda with Binyamin, Sheva Binyamin joined, and up north, you had the 10 Shvatim. So he set up roadblocks, not allowing Yidden to travel to the Beis HaMikdash. And the reason is because, like the Rambam says, Ein Yeshiva Ba'azara Ela L'Malchi Beis David Bavad. Only from the Malchi Yehuda, Malchi Beis David are allowed to sit in the Azara. So it's not going to be very honorable for him, respectful. He's going to come with everybody else, Aliyah L'Regel. And who's sitting over there? Rechavam is sitting. And Yeravam ben Navat, the king of Yisrael, is standing. So he set up roadblocks, and he set up for the Yidden places of Avodah Zarah. One was in Beis Kel, which is closer to the lower down, closer to where Malchi Yehuda were, the kingdom of Yehuda was, and one higher up in Don in the north, and that's where he set up Avodah Zarah. And that Avodah Zarah really stayed among the Malchi Yisrael for the entire 241 years. Now, a person can't say today, I know from Shevet Yehuda or Binyamin, even though we know that they were all expelled, because at the beginning when he did this, the Yidden that lived in the up north that wanted to go to the Beis HaMikdash, they left the kingdom of Malchi Yisrael, and they joined the rest of the Yidden under Malchi Yehuda, and which also caused another problem, which is that besides not having the Beis HaMikdash, the people who wanted to be in the Beis HaMikdash left. So it really decreased the level of Ruchnius by the Malchi Yisrael. Now the final king in Malchi Yisrael, his name was Hoshea. It says that he was a Rasha, but not as big as the previous ones. because he took down the roadblocks. The reason it says he was still a Russia was because even though he took down the roadblocks, he didn't destroy the Avodah Zarah. The Avodah Zarah wasn't destroyed for at least another 80 years until the 16th king of Malchei Yehuda, we'll see soon, Yeshayahu, which is, he started being king in the year 3285. The kingdom of Yisrael was destroyed in the year 3205. So it was a long time later until finally the Avodah Zarahs were destroyed. We'll just see very briefly, we're not going to go into it, the various kings. These are basically, you see over here, there's, like we said, 20 kings of Yehuda. 2 of them ruled for less than a year, so they're just added in the right location at the end. And then you have Malchei Yisrael. So very often you'll have like the father, and then the son took over, and then the general wiped out his whole family. That happened a couple of times. Basha was a general of Nadav, and he wiped out Yeravim's family. And then you had Basha and Elah, and then their general wiped them out. He's not even here, because he was a king for 1 week. He was a king for 1 week, enough time to wipe out the family, and then the army got rid of him, and they set up Omri. And then it continued like that. They were pretty much all the Malchei Yisrael, one after the next. That's how it goes. Until, like we said, Hoshea was king at the end for 11 years. He's the one, it's 8 years. 8 years. He was the one that finally removed the roadblocks. And we said before, Yeshayahu, whereas it's 31 years over here, that's where they finally destroyed the Avodah Zarahs. Now we'll move along to the Golus. But before we go to the Golus, we'll just mention, and I think most of us have the information, we just don't necessarily place it. So you can see over here, who was the one that was Mavalbal all the Ummas, and basically brought on the Kutim that made problems for the Yidden a few hundred years later, a couple hundred years over here. When they had to build the Beis Hamikdash the second time, they had a problem from the Kutim. The Kutim were brought into Eretz Yisrael this time, when Sanhedrin removed the 10 tribes, and it brought in other peoples. So over here, the power in the world, the dominant power was Ashur. And then we know that Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel destroyed the first Beis Hamikdash, so Ashur had shifted to Bavel. And then we know that the whole story of Purim during the Golus was Persia, Paras. So it shifted from Bavel to Paras. And then we know the story of Hanukkah was with Yavan. So it shifted to Yavan. And then finally the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash was by Rome. So it goes Ashur, Bavel, Paras, Yavan, and Rome. So let's move a little bit see a little bit about the time of the Golus. So during the Golus, like we said, he started off in Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. He was a king for 45 years. Then his son, Evel Merodach, took over him. Now Nebuchadnezzar, okay, we'll see it a little later. Okay, I'll mention it later. Evel Merodach basically freed a few people that were taken into captivity and imprisoned by Nebuchadnezzar. Then the next one is Belshazzar, who was actually the father of Vashti. Some say he was a son of Evel Merodach. Some say he was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Now he's the one that took out the Kalim of the Beis Hamikdash, and then you had the writing on the wall that night that he's going to be overthrown by Paras. He took out the Kalim because he made a cheshbon that the Yidden are supposed to be redeemed after 70 years. He made the cheshbon 70 years from when Nebuchadnezzar came into power, because Nebuchadnezzar is the one that's going to destroy the Beis Hamikdash. So the Yidden are supposed to go back to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash after 70 years from his start of his kingdom. And he counted 45, another 23 is 68. So 2 years into his ruling, he said, okay, look, it's not happening, and made a big celebration. He took out the Kalim of the Beis Hamikdash, and it was that very night that he was killed. And then that's when the power shifted during that period of time to Paras, where you have at the beginning, Daryavish was king for very short, and Kirish is the one that gave the Yidden permission to build the Beis Hamikdash, and then the Kutim basically undermined the whole thing. This is 52 years in. There was the first return, I think it says like 42,000 Yidden returned from whatever, modern day Iraq area to Eretz Yisrael, but then the whole thing was undermined by the Kutim. And then the next king was Achashverosh. He also made a bad calculation. He thought you calculate not from when Nebuchadnezzar became king, but 8 years later when he sent into Golus Yehoiachin. That's the first king of the Yidden that was dominated in such a strong way by Nebuchadnezzar. But it was wrong. You're supposed to start from the actual destruction. So Nebuchadnezzar put over here Yehoiachin, one of the kings, into prison, and over here Tzidkiyahu, and Evel Merodach freed both of them. And I think the day that he freed Tzidkiyahu died, that same day. And then for Bayesheni, the kingdom of Paras continued at the beginning for like 30 plus years. We'll see later that there's a Shar Shushan that had an engraving of Shushan there. It's connected to the kingdom of Paras. Then it shifted to Yavan, which ruled for 180 years, and right here is the story of Chanukah, and that's why you have in today's Rambam Shleisha Prakim. It says, and then the Malchus returned to the Yidden for more than 200 years, and you could divide it into 2 periods of about 103 years each, because the second 103 years, even though there were kings from the Yidden, but they were already under the control and the decision making of Rome. Somebody pointed out to me, seeing the dates, that the Rebbe said Hecher for 1900 year, that it's more than 1900 years from the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, was in Chav Tes. You see over here that it happened in Gimel Tov Chav Ches. So 1900 years later is Hey Tov Shin Chav Ches. The Rebbe said more than 1900 years later was the following year. So that's a little bit of the background of the Mishkan by Ezrushnoshim and the Golus, and followed by Sheni, just to point out again and just to see it. So during the Mishkan, primarily the Yidden were led by the Sheftim. During Ezrushnoshim was the Malachim and the Nevi'im. Some Nevi'im continued with them into Golus and brought them out. But pretty much from Sheni and on, you have the Tanaim, which continued for 120 years even afterwards. This is the year 0, by the way, for the English. 3760. That's why 5760 was the year 2000. And then, okay, so let's go now to the second part, which is the structure of the Beis Hamikdash. So the Rambam actually begins very differently. The Rambam starts from the inside out, because you start from the inside, the main thing. What was the purpose of the Beis Hamikdash? To kill them from the inside, and then finally get to the outer parts. We're going to do the opposite way. Because the reason I set it up that way is more like if you're actually coming to the Beis Hamikdash, that's how you're going to experience it. You're going to come through the Har Habayis. But beforehand, just to point out, all measurements over here are an amma, which is almost 19 inches. And one more thing is that when you come to the Beis Hamikdash, the main way you saw how grand it was in the height. So for example, if you're standing in an area and somebody tells you it's a mile by a mile or 100 miles by 100 miles, doesn't really make much of a difference. You are where you are, you see what you see. The main time a person feels small, so to speak, or how great something else is physically, is by the height. You're looking up and you're seeing how high it goes. And that's also how it was by the Beis Hamikdash. So for example, all the doorways in the Beis Hamikdash, except to the Ulam, which was twice as big, were 20 amas high and 15 amas wide, which is around 31.5 by 15 feet. If you're talking about, let's say, by a building, so if you look at the Empire State Building, each floor, it depends differently if the different buildings are made in different ways, but each floor is about 12 and a quarter feet. So you're talking about looking up one floor, 2 floors, and entering into the 3rd floor. That's the height of every door. A regular house is like around the house, regular houses in Kornites, that's like the height of all the doorways of the Beis Hamikdash. So let's start with the Har Habayis. So the Har Habayis, it says, was a perfect square, 500 amas by 500 amas, which is like 790 feet by 790 feet. And then in terms of where the Azara was located, so what we're told in the Mishnah and the Rambam is that it was furthest from the south, then from the east, then from the north, and then from the west. But it doesn't give a specific measurement. The Taisis Yom Tov says, for example, he gives us an example, the Shulta Geberin gives a different example. It would be 250 amas down here, 213, 115, and 100. Now, if you notice and you're familiar a little bit with the Beis Hamikdash, there's another structure here called the Ezrushnoshim, but that's not included here, because even though the Ezrushnoshim did have a higher level of Kedusha than the Har Habayis, but it wasn't integral, it's not fundamental to the structure. When you think of a Beis Hamikdash means that there's a building that's covered and has 2 rooms in it, one a Kodesh, a Kedoshim, one a Kodesh, with various items inside. By Sheni, we learn from the Navi you have to have also an antechamber, like a hallway beforehand. And then all of that is within a courtyard that's open to the sky, and there you have an outer Mizbeh. That's what the Azara is. The Ezrushnoshim is not fundamental to the structure, it was added. If you add the Ezrushnoshim, you have the least space to the east. But that's not how it's counted, again, because it's not negate to the basic structure. The Rambam writes, not everybody agrees, but the Rambam writes that the entire Har Habayis, except for these 2 areas, was covered with roofs, like little pergolas or porticos with coverings on top. So the whole Har Habayis, according to the Rambam, had roofs above it. Let's look at the entrances. You want to come into the Har Habayis. So on the south side down here, you have Sharei Chudah. There was 2 gates. Everywhere else there was 1. Sorry?
500
Yeah. It sounds like it was small structures. Maybe people could lean on beams and fabring.
Intermediate column.
Yeah, that's what it sounds. It sounds like it says it's like little. If to read how I remember the little shyness, but it sounds like little porticos, like small little structures, and they're all connected. And what ended up being is that you have a roof wherever you are. Yeah, it wasn't like one straight roof. The way he describes it, he says like these little. I don't remember. It's the buzz. I don't remember the lashon he uses, but it sounds like these small structures with wooden roofs. Yeah, maybe a little more permanent, so the rain doesn't come through with the schach. So you have 2 gates in the south. Sharei Chudah, that's where they say Chudah by Ezrushnoshim said her nevuah. Now you can see there's the most space in the south. There's also 2 gates. So the reason given for that is because if you go today to Eretz Yisrael, you go to the old city. The old city is over here. But when they built it, it wasn't called the old city. It was called the new city because there was a previous city, which is Ir David, which is down here. So the Yidden, when they came to the Beis HaMikdash, they were pouring in to the Har Bayis, mostly from the south. So there was 2 gates. There was more space over there. Then we move along to the east side, and we have Shar Shushan. So Shar Shushan had above it a depiction of the city of Shushan. There's 2 opposite reasons given. Some say the reason is that the government in Shushan required it, that they should know who is giving you permission to do this. There shouldn't be any type of rebellion, that you have your own autonomy. You have to know who's really the stronger, the power. They gave permission for it. Others say the opposite. You didn't put it there, not the opposite, but a different perspective. You didn't put it there to remind themselves, look where we came from. We were in Golus, it was a terrible time. And now, Baruch Hashem, we have the Beis HaMikdash. It says that the wall on top of Shar Shushan was not as high as the other walls. We'll see later exactly how it works, but the point, the Bekitzer, is that the Kohen, the Sgan Kohen, when he would do the Paraduma, at some point he was supposed to look through here into the Heichel. Now, in order to look into the Heichel, you wouldn't be able to look through the door. Because if you look through the door, which is 20 amas high, you would see stairs, because they kept on going higher and higher. So you'd have to look above the door. If the wall on top of the door is very high, he's not able to see anything. So that, we'll see in a moment, a little later, how it worked. So that was a little lower down. Then up north, you have a gate called Shar Tadi. So what was unique about Shar Tadi is that on top, it was instead of a regular doorway like this, the top of it was like this. I think there's an opinion that says the whole thing was like this. That's also connected to the name. Tadi means bowing. So it's like the 2 stones are bowing to one another. Another reason for the name is, we'll see later, there's a room over here called the Beis HaMikdash. It was part of a structure to enter into the Azara. And the Kohanim slept there at night, apparently because they wanted to be able to, the first second the day starts, they could do the Avodah. They'd have to come from their houses in Yerushalayim. They go straight into the Azara to do the Avodah. What if a Kohen discovered in the middle of the night that he's Tameh? He's a Balkari, a Zav. So there was a mikveh over there. He would go, it was down a winding staircase. He'd go down to the mikveh, he would toivel. There's also a bathroom there, so maybe people didn't know why he went down. He'd come back up, he'd join everybody. In the morning when the Kohanim would, with all their excitement, go into the Azara, he would slip out and go through Shar Tadi. So it says that's why it's called Tadi. Tadi is it means modest. So it was a quiet doorway that was used for such a situation. Another reason given for Tadi is that Tadi means a poem or a song. And so there was a lishka here. A lishka basically means a room. There's a lishka over here where the Levium would learn the Shir Shal Yom, and so I guess the name became attached. People are like, I'm going to the gate where the songs are, and then it became the gate of the Tadi, of the poem. Bechlal, throughout the Har Bayis, I think the Shilta Gebarim says that there were 31 lishachos or lishkos. The Tiferes Yisrael says there was 100. It's basically little rooms. They don't have to be so large. You have a room, a walk-in closet. If you wanted to get flour for your carbon mincha, you had sacks of flour there, whatever it may have been. If somebody wanted to donate money, donate kalim, there were these different rooms throughout the Har Bayis. And then finally we have Shar Kipainus here to the left. Let's do Shar Kipainus. Shar Kipainus here to the west. So 2 reasons are given for the name Kipainus. One is Kipainus means head, so it's next to the main part where the Kodesh HaKodashim is. Another one is that Kipainus means Avodah Sagan, work, the garden work. The reason for that is because in Yerushalayim, the halacha is you're not allowed to have any gardens in Yerushalayim. You have a garden, you have to bring in the fertilizer, the manure, it's going to smell, things get spoiled. So they didn't allow any gardens in Yerushalayim. But there was one garden from the days of the Nevi'im Rishonim, and it was located somewhere in this area. And so because of the importance, the cheshivas of having a garden there, then it became called Shar Kipainus. And there's an opinion that says, it could be the plug fell out. Open that. No? The electricity went off. Oh no, it's not, it's on. Okay, it looks like it just jumped maybe. There's an opinion that says that Kipasa Yardin, Rabbi Nosson Abavali Eimer, by the Keteris Af Kipasa Yardin Kolshi, they used the little Kipasa Yardin, it was taken from that gan. One more thing, it says that there were 3 Batei Dinim by the Beis HaMikdash. There was 2 of 23 judges. One was in the entrance of the Ezrushnoshim. One was in the entrance, another one of 23 by the entrance of the Azara. And then finally the Sanhedrin and the Gadol of 71 judges. And so if somebody was being elevated from one level to the next, so they would go from a regular Bezdin in their city to the one in front of the Ezrushnoshim, then from there to the one in front of the Azara. And from there they could be elevated to the one, the Sanhedrin. Also, if let's say there was a question that a local Bezdin had and they didn't have an answer, they would take it in that order to the one by the Ezrushnoshim, then the one by the Azara, and then to the Sanhedrin. The one by the Ezrushnoshim, somebody gave a shir recently. He said there's a drawn out map of the Azara and everything, and the Rebbe has notes on it. Saviat of the Rebbe, this is Levi Jacobson from Toronto, gave a shir, and the Rebbe places the Bezdin by the door, by the entrance of the Ezrushnoshim, and then the next Bezdin by the entrance of the Azara. See if we can, Start it up. I don't know if it's overheated. I can continue without it, but okay, here we go. Now it says the whole Har HaBayis itself was built kippin al gabe kippin, which basically means one row of kippin and another row. So what are these kippin? So basically the way Tumah operates is there's something called Tumah Retzutza. Tumah Retzutza means that if somebody's buried under the ground and above this dead person all the way to the top of the earth, but the person standing on, there's no space, everything is straight up, then the Tumah is Bekas Va'ila, it basically goes up to the Shemayim, endlessly. However, if there is some type of hollow that's the size of a tefach, then the tumah gets captured there. So if there's a mace in a room, the tumah doesn't go up, to the next floor. It gets captured within that room. So what they did is they made these kippin, these hollow areas. So this way, if there's a mace over here underneath, the tumah goes up, and then it gets captured here. It gets caught over here. But what happens if there's a mace under the pillars in between? It's going to go all the way up. So they made a second row. This way, if there's a mace here, the tumah got caught over here, and it didn't penetrate into the Har HaBayis. There was one exception, which is under the area of the Mizbeh. The Mizbeh has to be a Mizbeh Adama, which means it has to be attached to the ground. There can't be any hollow spaces. And so other than the Mizbeh, there was no kippin al gabe kippin. Then just quickly to refer to what we mentioned earlier, everything here is scaled. So over here you have a 20 amma high doorway. When you went into the base, when you went in 213 ammas, then you would go up into the Ezrushnoshim 6 ammas, you have the numbers in the bottom. And then you went into the Azara 7.5 ammas. Then you went into the Ezra's Kainim 2.5 ammas. And then you went into the Heichel another 6 ammas. Then the Heichel went for 100 ammas, it went down, then the whole thing went down. But if you do the math, you have 6 and 6 is 12, and another 10 is 22 ammas. So if you're going to look through the door of Shar Shushan, you're not going to see inside the door of the Heichel. You're going to see the stairs. Now obviously everything wasn't exactly straight. There was a ramp going to the Har Mishkan where they would do we mentioned before, the Parah Aduma, but you're not going to be able to see inside. And if they had a tall wall above the doorway and the person looks straight inside, they're going to be blocked by the wall. That's why the wall over there was lower down. It wasn't as high as the other walls around the rest of the Har HaBayis. Okay, so with that we basically went through the basics of the Har HaBayis, and we'll move along now to let's see the size relative to Crown Heights. So the Har HaBayis is basically, we said 790 feet by 790 feet. So it's like from Kingston to Brooklyn, and from Eastern Parkway, Union, President, almost to Carroll. Basically goes through the alley and halfway through the houses on the way to Carroll. Here's the area around where the Azara would be if you put it right there. And you can see it from another perspective. That's the size of the Har HaBayis. Now let's move along to the Ezrushnoshim. So the Ezrushnoshim, like you can see right away, is a perfect square. So in order to enter into the Ezrushnoshim, like we said, there were 12 stairs. Each step, all the steps except for one throughout the Beis HaMikdash were a half a amma by half a amma. So those 12 steps means it's 6 ammas up, which is around 9.5 feet. Now the Ezrushnoshim itself, it says it had this upper level for the woman. That's why it's called the Ezrushnoshim. Now what it says is that it was over here and over here. It doesn't tell us if it was partially over here or fully on these two sides, but certainly it was this area here. What it says in the Mishnayos and Sukkah is that when it came to the Simchas Beis HaSheva during Sukkos, they would draw the water, then the Nisach HaMayim was done the next day with the Karban Tamid Shel Shachar, together with the Nisach HaYayin. But the whole night they would celebrate. There was a lot of singing, a lot of happiness, a lot of dancing, and that could have led to a lack of tznius. So they made a tikkun gadol, which is they built this Ezrushnoshim, this upper level. Now some opinions hold that they built it each year anew. It was a structure built for Simchas Beis HaSheva. The rest of the year it wasn't there. Some say that they did leave beams on the wall so they could put it up more easily, but it was only there during Sukkot. From the Rambam, it sounds like it's always there. He doesn't say anything about Sukkot and Hilchos Beis HaBchira. He describes there's a Ezrushnoshim, and he says there was an upper level structure for the woman. Now the size of the Ezrushnoshim is 135 ammas by 135 ammas, which is around 212 feet by 212 feet. And as you can see, you have these corner areas. They're called, each of these areas, they're really rooms. It's called a lishka, l'shachis, lishkais. So those 4 of them on each corner, they were 40 ammas by 40 ammas, which is like 63 feet by 63 feet. Recently, somebody was saying that they weren't 40 by 40, they were 40 by 30. The Rambam says arboim. He doesn't say arboim al arboim. And in that Ksav Yad that I mentioned before from the Rebbe writes 40 by 30. And it is taka interesting because if you open up Yecheskel, it says 40 by 30. And we know that anything that was clear in Yecheskel, they incorporated into Bayesheni. So why didn't they incorporate it? So I don't know what the answer to that is. It could be, you have to look in Yecheskel, that it's not clear which direction is 40 and which is 30. To say that the Rambam says 40 by 30, you could say that, but he doesn't say 40 by 40, but he certainly doesn't say 40 by 30. And also in the Rebbe's Ksav Yad, the Rebbe, the person giving the shir themselves said, the Rebbe takes some different Rishonim, follows different Rishonim for different things. So it's possible the Rebbe is saying 40 by 30 according to one parish. The Rebbe is not determining that that's the opinion of the Rambam. Anyway, so that's an aside. Let's go through these rooms. So the first one here is called the Lishkas HaNazirim. It's where the Nazir would cook his carbon shlomim. There's a pasuk that tells us that the Nazir has to take the hair of his head and burn it over there, right where he's cooking the carbon shlomim. I don't know if it's considered a mitzvah to say, but it says he has to take the Sar Reishay and put it on that fire. So we know that the Nazir had to bring 3 karbanos, a chatos, an osham, and a oila, a chatos, an osham, and a shlomim. On the names of the karbanos, you can learn a lot about the carbon. The oila goes entirely to Hashem. The Kahanim do get the skin, for the leather of the carbon, but the meat is entirely consumed by the Mizbeh. A chatas is eaten by the Mizbeh and by the Kahanim, and a shlomim is like Malosh and Shalom. Everybody got a part of it, peace. So you had the Bailim as well as the Mizbech and the Kehanim. Up here you have the Lishkas Dira Eitzim, which Kehanim with our Bali Mum, they couldn't work in the Beis HaMikdash. So what they did is they would check the wood to make sure that there was no worms, it wasn't wet. So the wood is the best type of wood being used on the Mizbech. Over here you have a Lishkas of Mitzrayim, which had a mikvah, which is a question why did they need a mikvah? They already went through a whole process of taida, a very serious process of taida, and with 7 days in between and another process. There's no need to toivel. Some say they had to toivel because the Mitzvah is the highest level of tumah. He wasn't careful with his taida, so maybe he got tumah, so they had a mikvah there. And he would basically stand, the Mitzvah would come over here, there was a door called Shar Nikoner. He would stand in the doorway, and the last part of his taira is he had to have the blood of the carbon and the oil put on his bayin yadei yemanis, bayin yadei raglei yemanis, is basically his big toe of his right foot, his thumb and his ear. Now the thing is, he's not allowed to go inside because he's a mechusar kippurim, so he stood between the doorway. So somebody showed me earlier this week a Taisvus in Yavamis on the Zayim and Beis. It's a beautiful Taisvus. Taisvus basically says, it says that all the doorways in the Beis HaMikdash had the Kedusha of the Azara. All the entrances, except for Shar Nikoner, because this way the Mitzvah could stand in the doorway and get the Tyra by putting his foot and his hand and his ear inside. So Taisvus asks, why did they have to do it like that? Why wouldn't they Mekadosh the doorway, have the Mitzvah stand outside of the doorway and put everything into the doorway? It's part of the Azara. So Taisa says the reason is, and he's talking about him, the whole area here is open to the sky. He says for that little while that he's having the Taira happening, he should be protected. He should have shelter by the doorway. For that tiny period of time, everybody else is getting rained on, everybody else is hot. This Mitzvah has to get his Taira done. Let him enter the doorway. We won't be Mekadosh this doorway, unlike all other doorways. This one's not going to have the Kedusha of the Azara, so that the Mitzvah should be able to be sheltered in that period of time from the heat and the cold. And then finally, we have the Lishkas Beis Shmanya, where they kept the wines and the wine and oil, the wine for the Nusach Hayayin, the oil that were put on Karbanos Mincha. Some say it was also the oil of the Menorah. Over here, you can see there are steps. There's basically 15 round steps that led into the next section, which is the Azara, the main structure. And this is where Levim would stand and play their music during the time of the Simchas Beis HaSheva. So there's 3 sets of steers that were used in this type of way. You have these steers, the 15 steers, that's where the Levim played their music by the Simchas Beis HaSheva. Then there's another set of steers you're going to see before coming to the Mizbeach. That's with the Levim, it's called a Duchen. But it wasn't a Duchen for Birchas Kainim, it was a Duchen for the Levim to play their music by the Nisach Hayayin, Ein Shira Ela Alayayin. So they had a Simcha by the Nisach Hayayin, both in the Carbon Tamid in the morning and in the later in the day by the afternoon. And then the steers leading into the Heichel, that's where the Kahanim did Birchas Kainim. So you have the steers over here. Now, if you have steers going upwards, it's about 12 feet high. The next building, if you're going to come up to I'll pull this off. But you'd have, if you go up the stairs here, under here is, is the next section of the structure. So they basically built rooms underneath where they stored their instruments. They said it was good because of the moisture. It wasn't a damp place, so it would keep the instruments that were made out of wood, they wouldn't get damaged. And then I mentioned before, the Rebbe says that in the picture the Rebbe makes, it puts the Bezdin, that's in front, the Rebbe puts it right by the entrance. Because you'll see in other ones, it's sometimes over here or something. They put it in different places. Then the Rebbe put it, I don't know if it was a circle or an arrow, that it's by like it says, by the entrance. That's what it says, entrance of the Azara. The Rebbe puts it right by the entrance. And one more thing to mention is when you went into the door over here, it's really the next section, but we can mention it. It says there were smaller doors. So the smaller doors, some say it was within the bigger doors. That's another thing he brings to there. The Rebbe says it wasn't in the doors. It was on the side. Why did they have those doors? Because if somebody's leaving the Azara, they want to go out. So if you're going to go out of the Shar Nikanor, your back's going to be to the Beis HaMikdash, to the Heichel. So if it's a little if it's not directly in back, it's not as, but it's just direct. So therefore made the side doors for going out. So even if somebody was walking out in this way, they weren't walking out backwards, but it's not straight, their back is not right towards the Kodesh and Kodesh HaKadoshim. And that basically covers the Ezrushnoshim. Here we have the size. So we said it's 135 amas, like we said before, 212 feet. It's like from Eastern Parkway to Union. So you could, in general, anytime you're thinking of the Beis HaMikdash, Ezrushnoshim, the Azara, it's all around this size. When you're going into the Ezrushnoshim, going into the Azara, it's all going to be 135 amas, which is like 212 feet from Eastern Parkway to Union. And then in terms of the other way, it's from Kingston. It goes through the whole front, big building of 770, the main shul, the main building of 770, the yard, and part of the first building where the library is. You could see it. And so and then for the L'shachas, we said there were 63 feet around, 40 amas by 40 amas. So this is the one part that looks like it's big enough for purpose that it served. It's a nice size to keep the oils and the wines. It was from the whole front of the building, a little bit of the yard, and then the garden, the sidewalk, and almost the whole street. You can see it here from another direction. So that covers the Ezrushnoshim. Now we'll move along to the Azara. Where are we holding in time? What time do we officially have till? Till 9. Okay, so let's try to let's see how much we can go through. I don't know if we're going to get the whole thing, but try to cover a nice amount. So we have the Azara. The main thing in the Azara you have is a building called the Heichel, which you'll see in many pictures, and it says it's a Revutza Kari, it's like a crouching lion, it's wide in the front and narrow in the back, and a lot of pictures show it that way, but that's not the Rambam's opinion. The Rambam says it was a full square, and I think the Rambam writes, what about, it says it's supposed to be narrower? It says it got narrow like in a negligible way. You get a microscope, you'll see that it went a little in, but it wasn't in any pronounced way like many of the other pictures have. There's other opinions. Most opinions don't agree with the Rambam in this, but the Rambam has it as a perfectly square building, 100 amas high, which is around 160 feet, 100 amas wide and 100 amas deep. Then you had a number of sections here. The first section was Ezra's Yisrael, then you have Ezra's Kainim, and then you had the Mizbeh. In terms of the size, it was 135 by 187 amas, and the division, I'll go through this a little quickly, is 11 amas, just so you can see it up here. 11 amas, then another 11 amas, then 32 amas across the Mizbeh, 22 until the Heichel, 100 for the Heichel, and 11 behind the Heichel. And then in the other way, above the Mizbeh, it's 60 and a half amas, and then the Mizbech itself is 62 amas, and then below the Mizbech to the Dharm is 12 and a half amas. We're going to see later the importance of this area. It's basically, it's called the Tzofin. When it says Kodshei Kodashim Shechitasan Bat Tzofin, it means in this area here. That's the only place you could shecht Kodshei carbon, which is Kodshei Kodshim. Let's see now the entrances to let's see the size. So we said already, from Eastern Parkway to Union, and here it's longer, it's not 135, it's 187. It goes through the first 3 buildings. You can see over here more clearly, it goes all the way to the end of the 3 buildings. That's the size of the Azara. So let's start with the entrances. So there was 7 entrances. We know that it says there's 13 entrances, and there's different opinions brought down. The Rebbe says in a Sikha that it's not a machlekes, but B'metzias, everybody agrees there were 13 entrances. The argument is which ones were categorized, had the gedder, the definition of an entrance, which the nafkamina could be from mezuzah or things of that nature. But the Rambam doesn't mention them. I didn't put them in here, but there's really 13 entrances. The Rambam speaks of 7 entrances, 1 to the Mizrach, 3 to the Tzafin, and 3 to the Darim. The names under Mizrach, you had Shar Nikanor, the main entrance. To the Tzafin, you had the Beis HaMikdash. Then you had the Shar, it's a mistake, I think it's Shar Carbon, and then Shar Nitzitz. And then to the Darim, you had the Shar Hamayim, Shar B'chiris, and the Shar Hadelek. So the Shar Nikanor is the main entrance, is to the Mizrach. It's a famous story that happened with these doors. Nikanor was a person who went to Alexandria, to Egypt. He got these 2 beautiful doors for the Beis HaMikdash. And on the way there was a storm. They had to lighten the load of the ship. They forced him to throw overboard one of the doors. The storm didn't stop. They told him to throw over the second one. He said he's going along with it. They let it be. But when they got to Eretz Yisrael, he felt really badly about it. And says that when they saw that it came along with them, I think it says even which port, Akko or Yafo, or maybe it was Haifa, I don't remember what it was. I think it says in the Gemara which port it was. They came and they saw that it floated along. And I think there's another girsa that says it didn't float along, but it was swallowed by a whale that then spit it up. And so they had those doors by the Mizrach. It was actually the only doors. It says if the tzibur could afford it, everything should be plated with gold. Those doors are not made out of gold. They were made out of bronze. but they kept them there. There's two different reasons. I think the Rambam brings both reasons together. One is because of the miracle that happened. Number two is it's shone like gold. You're saying in its space where it was like, I don't know, could be. I don't know. Could be, I'm not sure. Saying it was, the sharim were swallowed in the ground. It could be. Yeah, it's possible. I'm not familiar with that. Then over here, we'll start with the tzafin. So this is a very big structure, the Beis HaMoiked. So it was a structure that had 4 rooms in it. I actually originally made the rooms on the corners, but there's a Ksaviyat from the Rambam. They put out a sefer the last couple of years with all the pictures. He has them off a little bit, so there's room around. So there's 4 rooms. The 2 inner rooms, because this is like inside the Azara, were Kodesh, and the 2 outer rooms were Chayil. It could be the whole building was in the Chayil, but they were Mekadesh in the Kedusha of the Azara. Some say it wasn't in the Chayil, it was really in the middle. The room over here is used for sheep. They always had 6 sheep for the carbon tamid. The next room was Lishkas Eisei Lechem Aponim, where they made the Lechem Aponim. The next room is where they had the stones of the Mizbeh that the Yevonim defiled. So it's interesting, you open up the Mishnah, it mentions that some places, but the main thing it says is called Lishkas HaChesamis. There's a room for Chesamis, whatever that was used for. The Rambam doesn't even mention it. He just says it was where the stones were placed. And then finally you had a room over here, which is called, it was called Beis HaMoiked because there was a... No, the Chesamis were something people came to get when they paid for different things in the Beis HaMikdash. Then they had like a proof of what they paid for, and they'd pick it up in their special places where they went to get it. With the, right, no. It's a chaysim is like a thing they would use. I forget if they got which type of carbon they got, and then they knew how much wine to give them and how much.
Before the Yevanim was used for.
Right. But the Rambam, I'm saying in Hilchos Beis HaBchira only mentions that. The other Mefarshim say it's called chaysamis, and they mention, and later they put the stones there also. And then you had the Moiked is like a what's it called, a fireplace. So either there's a fire here, some say no, the fire was here. That's why it's called a Moiked room. And here there's also a winding staircase that led to a mikvah and a bathroom. And the Kehanim basically would sleep. It says there was like these bleachers coming out of the walls. The older Kehanim would sleep on the bleachers. The younger Kehanim would sleep on the stone floor. And it says one of the tiles on the floor had a ring in it. One of the Kehanim slept on that tile. In the morning he would pull up the ring and he would there was keys underneath. They would use the keys to go into the Azara in the morning. So there's another, where is it? The doors, I'm pressing the wrong thing. The doors that led into the Azara, and then door that led out into the Harabayas. So the keys were under one of the tiles here. They would pick it up in the morning and open up the door into the Azara to start the Avodah. Let's move along to the next Shar. The next one's called Shar HaKarbonis, or Shar HaKarbon, I think it is. That's where they brought the Karbonis that were Kachim, that Shechitasim Batzofin. They can only shech them over here. The next one is called Shar HaNitzis. Shar HaNitzis was also like a structure, like the base, not like the Beis HaMoiked, but it was a structure in terms of having like a thing on top. And that's where the Kehanim guarded, because there was the different places the Kehanim guarded, the Levim guarded. And it's called Shar HaNitzis either because when you'd come to the gate, it had this roof on top, but there was no walls. It was like just beams holding up the ceiling until the sun shone very much in there. It was very bright. So it's called Shar HaNitzis because of the brightness of the sun, or because they brought the Eish Tamid through there. Then on the bottom we have the Shar HaMayim. There's a lot of reasons given for the Shar HaMayim, either because they brought the water for the Nisach HaMayim through there. Another explanation is because there's a nevuah, how there's going to be water coming out of the Kodesh, and it's going to get bigger and wider and stronger, and it's going to go into the Arabayis, it's going to go through the Shar HaMayim. Another reason is because the Shar HaMayim was also a structure. Above the Shar HaMayim, there was a mikvah. That's the union of Mayim. There was a mikvah, that's what the Kohen Gadol toiveled before the Avodah. Before you go into the Azor, you have to toivel, even if someone's tar, including the Kohen Gadol by Yom Kippur, so they would toivel in there. The next tefillas were done inside in a different mikveh that was over here in the Ezra Yisrael. And also on top of there was a place called the Beis Haftinas where they made the Keteris. Then you have the Shar HaBcheris, because the Bechir is one of the Karbonis that's Kachim Kalim, Shechitasim B'chol Mokim Ba'azara, so they're able to bring that carbon as well as other ones through this side. And then finally you have the Shar HaDelek. We mentioned the wood over here, so they take the wood out of the front door, they'd bring it around, and then they would bring it in through here. Others say it's called the Shar HaDelek because that's where they brought the Ish Tamid, not from the Shar HaNitzis, but from the Shar HaDelek. Okay, so that gives us the entrances. Now we can enter into the Azara and see the different parts of the Azara. So let's start with the Ezra Yisrael. So the Ezra Yisrael is shockingly small. It was 135 amas, which you already said is the size of like Eastern Parkway to Union, but it was only 11 amas wide, and that's the limit where Yisrael could go. If Yisrael was doing some Aveda, he had to do the smicha, or if he was shechting, because shchitos ksher bazar, he could go in further. But if you're not doing any type of Aveda, and you're not, and a person's not Tomei, the limit of Yisrael is still here, which is 11 amas wide. In terms of what that looks like, this is what it is. It's the sidewalk on Kingston from Eastern Parkway to Union. It's actually even a little bigger than 11 amas. This is like 11 and a half amas. That's the whole area of the Eretz Yisrael. And to add to that, there was 8 different lishachis. Again, a lishka is a room. 8 lishkas, 8 rooms in this Eretz Yisrael. So you had to fit all of that into that space. Yeah, I'm saying if a Yid came, it said why would Yidden come here? It says, L'ishtachves or L'hispalo. So a Yid wants to come and bow to this way. So it says, Oimdim Tzvufim. As I was saying, it sounds like Oimdim Tzvufim, Mishtachim Revachim. You think the miracle is Mishtachim Revachim. It sounds like the miracle is that Oimdim Tzvufim. How did they fit in there? I don't know. So in general, the Ezrushnoshim, it could be, I don't know, but l'chayr it's over here because the Ezrushnoshim is not fundamental to the structure of the Beis HaMikdash. Actually, Rashi writes that what does it mean, Oimdim Tzvufim? Tzvufim Eloshin Tzof. They actually, according to Rashi, when they came into bow the Yom Tevim, they would spread out all the way around here. They would flow into the back over here. Maybe that's considered a reason to come in, but that's I don't know if Rashi says they're allowed to do that. That's what happens. I'm not sure how it works with what's in terms of that boundary that it's supposed to be up to there. So you have 8, like we said, 8 l'shachas, 3 in the tzafin, just like the doors, 3 in the darim, and then 1 on each side of the Sha'ar Nikanor. So let's go through them briefly. The 3 in the north were the Lishkas Agazis, where the Sanhedrin was. Now the Sanhedrin, we said already, you're not allowed to sit in the Azara, except Malchi Beis David. The Sanhedrin weren't standing all day. So a portion of it was in the Ezra Yisrael, but most of it was outside here in the Harabayas, an area called the Chel. Then next to it you had, actually it says that it was like this. It wasn't 3 rooms like 1, 2, 3. It was the Lishkas Agazis was like that way, it's over here, like longer. And then here was the Lishkas Agayla where they had water. They had a thing where they get water for the Azar from. And over here was the Lishkas Ha'etz, which was later called the Lishkas Parhedrin. So here would be like, let's say the Lishkas Agazis, half of it. And then the other half, you have 1 room over here for the water and 1 room here where the Kohen Gadol was 7 days before. But that's what I was wondering, the entrance for the water. That's right over here. Keep in mind, the rooms, especially if you move today in Crown Heights, if you're giving a shir in Muncie, it's a little harder to explain. People don't know what, but in Crown Heights, especially if you live in East Flatbush, if you have 10 by 10, it's a good bedroom for a couple of kids. They didn't need to have huge rooms. It's a room for the Kohen. What does he need? He needs a bed. I didn't have to have he didn't have furniture and anything. He had a bed for the water. Let's say you have a closet for salt. How much, they will see Lishkas HaMelech, for flour. They don't need a huge thing. You have 20 sacks of flour. They bring more new flour each day. You don't need such a big room for it. The doorway of one of them is a little, I was wondering actually the doorway for the Lishkas Agayla. But it's a Kohanim, so they could have a door over here. They could come in from the Ezra's Kohanim maybe. So this is where the Kohen Gadol slept 7 days before Yom Kippur. There's a whole sikh from the Rebbe about the change of the name. We used to be called Lishkas Ha'etz. The simple reason is because it was a Kohen Gadol had a Riches Yamim. He went into the Kodesh Kodashim and he lived out the year and he had a Riches Yamim. But later on, when the Kohen Gadol was already appointed and it was like a thing for money, then they changed it to Lishkas Parhedrin, which means appointed. And there's a sikh where the Rebbe explains that this is Avodah Vatzadik, Avodah Baal Tshuva. So the Lishkas Agazis is called, I'll say very briefly, the name Gazis is either because the main avodah of the Sanhedrin had different things they could do that others couldn't do. For example, they could expand the Azara, they could expand even the borders of Yerushalayim, but they weren't doing that 24/7, or they could be judge of Ir and Idachas. What they were mostly occupied with was determining the kashrus of the Kohanim. And that's what it says. If there was a Kohen that was kosher, they made a big yomtiv. So Gazis means like lashon of to remove, siluk. So they were basically deciding who would be removed from the kohuna. Another explanation for Gazis means like a Evan Gazis, a stone that's cut. They were mechatech the din. Another one is that the room was actually made out of these very nice Gazis stones, because this is the most prominent entity. You have all the way, every time you're talking about how the Torah was given over, it's Edliu Beis Dinei. The Beis Din is talking about the Sanhedrin, so they had a room made out of these nice stones. The Lishkas Agayla is called the Gayla either because the Bnei Gayla dug the well. Another explanation is because they was brought up with a galgal lashon of Gayla. Another one is because they filled up the pail, and a pail is called it brings a pasuk for it, has lashon Gayla in it. Then down in the Durham side, we also had 3 rooms. So they were the Lishkas HaMelach, where they kept the salt. They used the salt to kol karban takrav melach. You have to have salt on all the karbanos. Also, they put salt on the ramp so it wouldn't be slippery. And then the next one is called the Lishkas Aparva. That's where they would, the skins that the Kohanim would get, they would salt them over there. And then finally, Lishkas Amadichin. So really they would wash down the karbonis, the meats over here in the tzafin. There was a section, there was tables. So one of the explanations for why they needed Lishkas Amadichin is because some of the parts they wouldn't want to wash in the actual Azara, like the stomach and the intestines, it was filthy. It's not covered to do it in the middle of the Azara, so they did it in the Lishkas Hamadichin. One more thing is on top of the Lishkas Aparva, there was a mikvah. That's what the Kohen Gadol toiveled on Yom Kippur. When he had to switch clothing, he started with, it was Zav at the beginning, Zav at the end, and Zav in the middle, and twice Big Day Lavan. Between each change, he would do 2 Kiddush Yadayim for Reglaim and 1 mikvah. So those times that he toiveled, that had to be in the Azara. So he used this mikvah on top of where they salted the skins. And then you have 2 more rooms. The Lishkas Pinchas Amalbish is where they would keep the Big Day Kohuna. The first person in charge, they say his name was Pinchas. He was a tzaddik, so he got his name. And then Lishkas Eisei Chavitin, the Kohen Gadol every day would bring a Minchas Chavitin, Machatzisei Bebayker, half together with the Talmud Shel Shachar, and half it later in the day by the Talmud Shel Bein Arbayim. Each one had 6 breads. So this is where it was made. So that covers the Ezra's Yisrael. It says the whole Azara had an awning coming out of it. It doesn't say a size, I just picked a size. And what happened was in the morning, if you remember, the Kohanim were in the Beis HaMikdash. Now the Beis HaMikdash had this huge door, like all the other doors, it was 20 amas high. In the morning, at the beginning of the day, before the Avodah, 2 groups of Kohanim would open up smaller doors that were in the door, a regular sized door. They would go in and they would be boilish. They would inspect the whole Azara. And they would meet up over here by the Lishkas Eisei Chavitin. They had some nusach, as everything's good, yeah, it's good. And then they would go back to the Lishkas, to the Beis HaMikdash. They go through the small door, they would close it. Then they would open up the big doors, and that's when the Kohanim would pour into the Azara and start the Avodah each day. And actually, when they did the raffles, there's a whole raffle system that they did to see who's going to get which part of the Avodah. They did it in the Lishkas Agazis, in the part that was we said part of the Lishkas Agazis was in the Azara. That's where they did the raffles. Now we'll move to the Ezra's Kainim. The Ezra's Kainim is basically, in order to get into the Ezra's Kainim, there was first 1 steer. It was the only step in the Beis HaMikdash that was an Amma. It was an Amma high, and I think it was an Amma wide. And then afterwards there's a Duchan of 3 steers. I was actually wondering about the Duchan. This is the same size like we said before about the Ezra's Yisrael. The Duchan, the way they showed in pictures, they show a Duchan like this. Let's say, where is the west? It's that way. So they show the Duchan like this. In other words, the higher step is further from the Heichel, and this way the Levim are standing towards the Mizbeh and singing by the Nisach HaYayim. But when it's described in the Rambam, it's the other way around. It's, in other words, you're walking upstairs this way. So the highest step is closer. So I'm not sure it says they stood on the Duchan. It sounds like there was 1 stair here. And if you're looking this way, and then a lower stair and a lower stair, as opposed to lower as opposed to the higher stair in the back, further back, like bleachers that they're standing on, you can see them. So this is what we said already. They would say shear on the carbon over here. Now you have a section which we mentioned, which is 76 amas by 60.5 amas. We said 11, 11, 32, and 22. It's 76 by 60.5. And this is a very important part of the Beis HaMikdash, B'chlal, especially learn Chassidus. But in general, you see the main thing that happened in the Beis HaMikdash were karbonis. That's the main thing. And so the kachei kachim could only be shechted in this area right here, which is called the tzafin. So the size of the tzafin, we'll just show what it looks like, 76 by 60.5 amas. It's like exactly the building of 770. I'm saying the shul part. It basically goes the whole front and all the way to the back of it. So how was this divided? So there was 4 sections. There was 8 amas empty at the beginning, 8 empty amas at the end, and then in between there was rings. That's where they would do the shechita. There was basically 24 amas of rings, 4 rows of 6 or 6 rows of 4 rings. The way they use the rings, there's different opinions how they use the rings. 2 opinions say that the rings actually were picked up, like on one side and put back down, and they put either the head of the animal or the legs of the animal there. I think Rabbeinu Chananel, I think, says that no, they put a string around the animal's legs and then they pulled it through the ring. And that way the animal was immobile and they were able to shecht it. And then you have an area over here of tables where they would rinse everything off. And then you have an area where they would hang up the animal in order to skin it. They had these blocks, made out of wood, and they had hooks in the wood. They would hang the animal and skin it over there. And it looks like we're out of time. There's obviously a lot more. There's the Mizbeh, and in the Mizbeh itself, there's a lot of different elements to the Mizbeh, but it shows. I'll show you one last thing. The size of the Mizbeh. This is actually one of the structures that is a lot bigger than people think. The Mizbeh the bottom of it is 32 amas. It's like from this wall in 770 to this wall. And the length is from the front of 770 all the way till here. And if you add the ramp, Then it goes literally all the way to the back of 770. The ramp would basically be till here. So you have a ramp going up till here, and then the whole front is the front of the Mizbeh, and it's almost as tall as the ceiling in 770. Now, I wasn't able to measure it. The measuring tape kept on bending over. So I had to get one of the laser ones to see, but I think it's almost till the ceiling in 770. One of the more fascinating parts that the Rambam has different than others, again, we're not able to get to it, is the inside the Kodesh, inside the Heichel, the building of the Heichel, which was a huge building. When you walked into the Heichel, you looked up, the ceiling was about like a 5.5 story building high. And then around the whole Heichel, you had the structure of the Taim. Okay, we're not able to even roll it up. But there's a lot more to learn. And shukach everyone for joining.